The bridge crossed the river on 7 stone piers, and it was the piers she had come to look at, though she had not known that until she was standing on the bank looking at them. She had been walking the low country for days, the wide, slow, flat country where a great river gathered itself and moved through the land without hurry. And she had come to the crossing in the long yellow light of the late afternoon and stopped on the near bank and looked at the thing the old railroad had built to get its trains across the water. It was a long bridge, a span of iron trusses carried on 7 towers of dressed stone that stood up out of the river in a row, and the rails had been pulled from it a lifetime ago, so that it carried nothing now but its own weight and the weight of the birds, and it stood in the moving water in the yellow light with the river braiding white around the cutwaters of its piers. And it had the patient permanence of a thing built to outlast the purpose it was built for, which it had. She stood on the bank a long while and read it the way she read all such places, by what was left and what it told her. The piers were the old work, the good work, great tapered towers of dressed granite with their upstream ends drawn to a knife's edge of a cutwater, to split the current and the ice, laid up block on block by men who had understood that the enemy of a river bridge is not the weight it carries, but the water it stands in, and who had built the piers to fight the water for 1,000 years and the deck to carry trains for 100, and had been right about both. The deck was going now, the iron truss gone to a deep even rust, the walkway rotting on its brackets. But the piers stood as square in the river as the day they were set, and it was the piers she had come for. She was 24 years old, and she carried the whole of what she owned on her back, 30 pounds of it. Paired over the years to the few things that earned their place, a change of clothes rolled tight, a folding knife worn smooth at the spine, matches in a plastic bread bag, a tin cup, a stub of candle, a soft-covered notebook with a pencil in its spine, and a little under $9 folded in the back that she had not needed to spend in some days. She wanted little enough from the world that she could carry all of it out along a dead railroad bridge over a wide river to see what 7 stone piers were hiding, and that was what she meant to do. Because a pier is a hollow thing or it is a solid thing, and a solid pier is only a solid pier. But a hollow one is a room, and she had learned that the difference between a wall and a home is only ever a door, and she had come to look for a door. She found it on the 3rd pier out. She had gone out along the bridge on the walkway that ran beside the vanished rails, a plank catwalk on iron brackets that the tenders had used, gone punky in places but sound enough for a careful person who kept to the brackets, and she had looked down at each pier as she passed above it, at the great tapered stone tower falling away beneath the deck to the white water 30 feet below, and on the 3rd pier she saw the ladder. It was set into the downstream face of the pier, iron rungs going down the stone from the deck to a narrow ledge at the waterline, a maintenance ladder for the men who had tended the piers against the river's long patient work of undermining them, and the rungs were worn. Not rusted to nothing the way the deck brackets were rusted, worn, the rust rubbed thin and smooth on the tops of them by hands and boots that had gone up and down them not for the railroad's few years of tending, but for a lifetime. And she stood on the catwalk above them and looked down the worn ladder to the ledge at the waterline and knew, the way she always knew, that someone had made that pier a place they went, and that a person does not wear a ladder smooth going down to nothing. She went down. It was 30 feet of iron ladder down the downstream face of the pier, with the river running loud and green below her boots, and she climbed it the way she climbed everything, close to the stone, 3 points of contact, not looking at the water, braiding past beneath, but at the rungs under her hands, feeling the smooth, worn tops of them where a stranger's grip had polished the iron. There was a particular fear to this one that she had not felt on the ladder up the water tower or down into the mine. The fear of the moving water below, the way it pulled at the eye and the mind, the way a person's body wants to watch a thing that could take it, and the watching is the very thing that unbalances you, and she knew that fear and gave it nothing. Kept her eyes on the iron and her weight on the stone, and went down rung by worn rung, with the river talking loud beneath her, and the lower she went, the louder the river spoke, and the colder its breath came up off the green water, and at the bottom she came out onto a narrow stone ledge just above the reach of the water, a shelf that ran along the base of the pier on its downstream side, where the cutwater split the current and left a pocket of stiller water in its lee. And set into the stone of the pier, there on the sheltered ledge above the waterline, framed and fitted and shut against the river, was a door. It was iron, gone the deep even brown of old rust, and its latch was worn bright in the middle of all that brown, by a hand that had worked it, and she stood on the wet ledge with the river running past a foot below her boots, and looked at that bright latch and felt the lift her heart had learned to give. She lifted the latch. The door came, greased, silent, swinging inward into a dark that breathed out at her a cool, dry air smelling of stone and tallow and old paper and the faint green breath of the river, and she stooped and stepped in off the ledge and into the hollow heart of the pier. And she was not the first. She stood just inside and let her eyes come to it. The chamber was built into the hollow of the pier, a room in the great stone tower with the river running past its walls on every side, and it was made in 2 levels, and that was the first thing she understood about it and the most important, though she did not know yet how important. The lower level, where she stood, was the watchroom, a snug stone chamber with a plank floor and a stove and a table, and, along the downstream wall, a long low window, thick glazed and iron shuttered, that looked out just above the water at the river running away downstream in the yellow light. It was a fine room. The window made it fine, the long green reach of the river running away in the evening light, the stone dressed smooth and dry. The stove set where its heat would fill the space, and she could see that its keeper had loved it, had made it not a shelter merely, but a place to sit and watch the water from. A room built around a window, the way the tunnel room had been built around its slot, a whole life pointed at a view. And from the lower room an iron ladder went up through a hatch in the stone ceiling to an upper level, a smaller chamber higher in the pier, above the reach of any water, plainer and darker and without a window, a place to sleep and to keep things dry, and nothing more. And she understood. Standing at the foot of that inner ladder and looking up at the plain safe room above the fine dangerous one, that the person who built this had built it in 2 levels for a reason, and that the reason was the river, and that a house built in 2 levels against a river is a house that expects, someday, to have its lower level in the water. But that was a thing she understood only with the front of her mind, that first evening, as a fact about the architecture. She did not yet understand it in her body, the way she would come to understand it, and so she settled into the lower room, the watchroom, with its stove and its long window on the river, because it was the better room, the room with the view and the light, and she lit the lantern as the day went, and the chamber came up warm and brown around her, with the river running green past the window. And on the table, weighted under a smooth river stone worn round by the water, there was a book. She took it up, and she did not open it yet, because she had a habit now of guessing at them first, of letting them be a question for one evening before the ledger made them a life, and she sat with the closed book on her knees and looked at the 2-level room and the long window on the river and guessed at a man who watched the water. A tender, someone whose work had been the river and the bridge and who had loved it past the ending of the work. Then she opened it, because the book was the kindness and the book was the rule, and she had learned in a rising tank in the dark, and again beneath a laboring train's smoke, never to sleep in a stranger's house without first reading the thing the stranger had left to be read. And she was glad, that night more than she had ever been, that she had learned it. He had been a bridge tender, and more than that, a pier keeper, one of the men whose work in the old days was to watch the piers of a great river bridge against the 2 things that kill such bridges, which are the flood and the ice. He wrote of it in a plain square hand on the first page. I keep the 3rd pier. I have kept it 40 years. I know this river better than any man living, and I do not trust it the length of my arm. He had watched the river from the long low window, watched it in every mood and season, the low green summer water and the brown roaring spring flood and the grinding ice of the hard winters, and his work had been to see the danger coming and signal it, to warn the line when the river ran too high or the ice built too thick against the cutwaters, so that no train would trust itself to a bridge the river was in the act of taking. He wrote of the ice with a particular respect, the way it came down in the breakup, grinding and shouldering in great pans, that could lean on a pier all winter and find the one flaw in 100 years of stone, and of how he had watched for it and gone down onto the ledge in the killing cold to read the set of it against the cutwater and know whether the pier would hold. And of the winter it had not quite held, and he had signaled the break in the stone, and the railroad had come and mended it in the spring. And of how that one winter had justified, to his mind, the whole 40 years of watching. Because a bridge that does not fall is a bridge that no one thinks about, and no one had ever thought about his bridge, and that was the measure of how well he had kept it. And when the line closed and the rails came up, and there was no more railroad to warn, and no more trains to keep off the bridge, he had not gone. Because he could not. He wrote, make himself stop watching a river he had watched for 40 years, could not believe the river would behave itself just because there was no longer anyone paid to distrust it, and so he had stayed on in the pier, keeping his watch over a bridge that carried nothing, distrusting the water on behalf of no one, because the watching was the thing he was. And he wrote about the flood. Of course he did. The flood was the whole of his life's fear and study. He wrote of how the river rose, the slow spring rises he could see coming for days in the color and the smell of the water, and the fast rises, the killing rises, the ones that came down from a cloudburst in the hills upstream or, in the bridge's working years, from the sudden opening of a dam's gates far up the river, a wall of water that could climb the piers a foot an hour with no warning but the one the river itself gave to a man who knew how to read it. And he had cut a gauge into the stone of the window's edge, a scale of marks, and painted one of them red, and beside the red mark in the ledger, set apart in the middle of a page with a line ruled above and below. He had written the rule that was the whole of the room's meaning and the whole of the reason it was built in 2 levels. When the water climbs to the red mark, do not wait to see if it will stop. Open the sluice and go up. And below it, smaller, the why of it, because he was a man who wanted the next one to understand and not just obey, the lower room is meant to flood. Let it. Open the sluice and let the river fill it and pass through, or the water will find its own way in and trap the air and burst the door. Go up and wait, and the river will give the room back when it is done. She read that rule 3 times, and she found the gauge at the window's edge, the cut marks and the one worn red, and she found the sluice, an iron plate and a lever low in the downstream wall that would let the river into the lower room in a controlled flood rather than a bursting one, and she found the inner ladder up to the dry upper chamber, and she understood the whole terrible sense of it. A room built to drown so that its keeper need not, a lower floor surrendered to the river by design so that the river, given what it wanted, would not take the rest. It was the strangest architecture she had met in any of the hidden places, and the wisest, a house that survived the flood not by keeping the water out, but by letting it in. And she turned it over in her mind a long while, and found she could not improve on it. That a mind older and more patient than hers had already thought its way past every objection she could raise. She marked the red line and the sluice lever and the inner ladder in her mind, the way she had marked the shutter cord above the tunnel and the drain wheel in the tower. And she went up the inner ladder that first night and slept in the dry upper chamber and not the fine lower room with the view. Because a person who has just read that the fine room is meant to flood does not sleep in it until she knows the river. And she did not yet know the river, and the not knowing was the only wisdom she had. The river rose on the 4th day. There had been rain in the hills. She had not seen it, down in the flat country under a clear sky, but she had seen its coming in the river, the way the bridge tender's ledger had taught her to see it. the water going from green to a troubled brown, the level creeping up the gauge at the window a mark, and then another, and she had watched it through the long low window with the ledger open beside her and her heart going quiet and careful, because she knew now what the marks meant, and she watched the brown water climb toward the red one. She was glad, watching it past any words for it, that she had not slept in the fine lower room those first nights, that she had read the rule before she needed it, and kept to the upper room until she knew the river. Because a person who had settled into the lower room and made it home and gone soft in the comfort of the view would have watched this water climb with a very different heart, would have wanted to believe it would stop, would have waited, and the waiting would have killed her. She had not gone soft. She had kept the rule between herself and the river from the first night, and now the river was calling the rule due, and she was ready for it, and the readiness was the dead man's gift. It climbed slow at first through the morning, a mark by noon, and she thought it might be one of the slow rises the tender wrote of, the kind a person could watch all day and sleep through. And then, in the early afternoon, it changed. The river went from a climb to a surge, the water leaping up the gauge, 2 marks in an hour and then the red one coming. And she understood that somewhere far up in the hills a whole day's rain had gathered itself into the river's throat, and was coming down all at once, a fast rise, a killing rise, and it was going to pass the red mark, and it was going to pass it soon. She did not wait to see if it would stop. That was the whole of the rule and the whole of what 40 years of a dead man's watching had bought her. Do not wait to see if it will stop. She went to the sluice lever in the downstream wall, and she got both hands on it and threw her weight, and it was stiff. It was stiff the way they were all stiff 50 years, and more of stillness in the iron. And she hauled on it with everything she had, and it gave, groaning, and the iron plate drew back, and the river came into the lower room, came in a cold brown rush through the open sluice, exactly as the tender had built it to come, filling the lower room in a controlled flood rather than bursting the door, and she did not stay to watch it fill. Every part of her that was not the part that had read the rule wanted to fight the water, wanted to slam the sluice and seal the door and keep the fine room dry, and she knew, because the dead man had known and written it, that fighting the water was the thing that would kill her, that a sealed room in a rising river is a bubble the river will crush or burst, and that the only way to keep the pier was to give the river the floor it wanted and go up above the giving. So she gave it. She let the river into her house with her own 2 hands on the lever against every animal thing in her, because a man who had watched the river for 40 years had told her to, and she trusted his 40 years over her own terror, and that trust was the whole of what the ledger was for. She took up the ledger and the lantern, and she went up the inner ladder through the hatch into the dry upper chamber, and she drew the hatch cover over behind her, and she sat in the small high room in the lantern light and listened to the river take the room below. It was a terrible sound and a strangely peaceful one, once she understood it was meant to happen. The water rose in the lower room. She could hear it climbing the walls she had sat beside, could hear it lift and float the stool and knock it soft against the stone, could hear the whole fine room with the view going under. And the pier stood in the flood with its lower heart full of river and did not fall, because it had been built to stand so, built by people who took the river's terms and made a home that could give the river a floor to fill and keep a floor to live on, and she sat in the dry upper chamber above the drowned lower one and was not afraid, because the dead man had been afraid for her. 40 years ago, afraid enough for both of them, and had built and written against the fear so that she would not have to feel it. She sat with the ledger on her knees and the lantern between her boots, and she listened to the river in the room below, and she thought about him, the man who had known this would happen some day to someone, who had built a second floor and cut a sluice and painted a mark red and written a rule, all of it aimed across 40 or 50 years at a stranger he would never meet, at this night, at her, sitting exactly where he had known she would have to sit, kept dry and alive by the reach of a mind long gone into the ground. The river crested in the night. She heard the change in it, the sound of the surge going off the top and beginning, slowly, to fall. And toward dawn the water in the room below began to draw down, sinking back the way it had risen, giving the room back as the tender had promised it would, and by the full light of morning the lower room stood empty again, but for the river's brown film on everything, and the stool floated into a corner, and the river ran green and chastened past the window, back within its banks, and the pier stood as it had stood for 100 years, having given the flood a floor and kept the rest. She went down the inner ladder into the wet lower room in the morning light, and stood in the river's leavings, and felt no dismay, only a kind of awe at the sense of it. And she took up her own notebook and turned to a fresh page and wrote the rule down first, the way she had come to do. Before anything else, when the water climbs to the red mark, open the sluice and go up. Do not wait to see if it will stop. She underlined it twice, and below it she wrote a second line, which was not a rule but which she found she needed to set down. He was afraid of this river for 40 years, so that I would not have to be afraid of it for one night. She looked at that a while in the wet gray light. Then she got to work, because the room needed it, and work was the thing she did with a feeling once she had felt it. The days took on a shape. She stopped counting them. She cleaned the river's film from the lower room and dried it out and set it to rights, and she learned to live in the two-level way the tender had lived, the lower room for the fine days and the view, the upper for sleeping and for keeping the things the river must not have. And she came to read the river the way he had, to know a rise a day before it came by the color and the smell of the water, and she was never again caught by it. Because she watched the gauge, and she kept the sluice lever greased and free, and she knew the red mark, and she did not wait to see if it would stop. She came to love the river without ever coming to trust it, which she understood now was exactly the thing the tender had felt, the two feelings held together, the love and the distrust, neither one canceling the other, the way you might love a great animal you would never turn your back on. She watched it in its moods from the long, low window, the low, clear green of the settled weeks when it ran like something asleep, the troubled brown of the rises, the strange gray glassy look it took before the hardest weather, and she learned to read it the way she had learned to read the wind in the tank and the flame in the shaft, until the river was not a danger she feared, but a language she spoke, and the speaking of it was the watch, and the watch was the thing she had become. She took up his watch without ever deciding to, the way she had taken up the watchwoman's above the tunnel, sitting at the long, low window in the evenings and reading the great river as it moved through the land, its moods and its rises and the slow brown business of it carrying the hills down to the sea, a grain at a time. And she found that the watching filled the place in her it had filled in him, the need to keep a vigil over a thing too large to halt, to distrust the river faithfully on behalf of no one, to belong to the great moving world sidelong and unseen from a window in a stone. She greased the inner ladder and the sluice. She mended the shutter of the long window where the flood had wrenched it. She drew her water from a rain barrel she rigged on the upper chamber's little vent to the sky, because the river's water was not to be trusted to drink, though it was fine to watch, and she left untouched the small things that had been the tender's. Out of the courtesy, she paid all of them. She never learned the whole of him. She did not expect to. But she came to know the shape of his mind by keeping his watch and living in the two-level wisdom of his house, and she thought that he had been the most patient of all the keepers she had found, a man who had given 40 years to distrusting a river that mostly behaved, waiting through 1,000 quiet days for the few that were not quiet, and had counted the waiting worth it for the once or twice it saved a train, and then had gone on waiting after there were no trains, for no one, because the waiting was the thing he was. She understood that now. She had become, in her way, the same, a keeper of a watch no one had asked her to keep, and she had stopped thinking it strange, because she had met 6 of them now. 6 lives laid down in 6 hidden places and handed on to her through a worn ladder or a greased hoist or a rule set apart on a page, and she had begun to understand that she was not finding these places by accident, that a person who walks the dead lines looking for doors is a person the keepers had been waiting for all along, the next pair of hands. The one who would come and read the rule and keep the watch and not let the long patient keeping lapse into the dark. On an evening, in the falling of the year, she sat in the lower room by the ticking stove with the lantern lit and the tender's ledger closed under its round river stone, and her own notebook open on her knee, the long low window showing the great river running green and easy and low past the pier in the last of the light, well below the red mark, behaving, for now. She had lived in the pier through a whole turn of the seasons now, and had seen the river do most of the things the ledger warned of, the spring flood, and the summer low, and the first grinding pans of the winter ice leaning on the cutwater, and she had met each of them with the dead man's knowledge, and kept the pier through all of them. And the pier had become hers in the only way a place like this ever becomes anyone's, not by the finding of it, but by the keeping of it through the thing it was most afraid of. She was 24 years old. She had a folding knife, a box of matches, a tin cup, and a little under $9 she had not spent, and now had nowhere to spend, and did not miss. She had a room in the hollow heart of a bridge pier with a river running past its walls, a fine lower room for the view and a dry upper one for safety, a gauge cut in the stone and a rule that had saved her, and a sluice she kept greased and free, and a book she had not written full of a life spent watching water. She turned to a fresh page and smoothed it flat with the side of her hand, and the river ran past the window the way it had run for 10,000 years, and would run for 10,000 more, patient and enormous and not to be trusted the length of an arm, and she began to write, in the plain square hand she was learning, from a man 40 years dead, the first line of the keeping of the only home she had ever made her own.